Good morning, Revolution, everybody, and welcome to our stream. Welcome, Anita, Joel, and
Morning.
Scott. Hope everybody's doing good. We're talking the decline and fall of Western Marxism this morning. Is there such a thing? If so, when did it arise? How is it falling, or has it fallen? And then what are the uh, prospects for a renewed Marxist Leninist approach to politics, both domestically and internationally? And with that, let's get started. Anita, you're back in, before we dive deeply into the program, you're back in Columbus. And I
Mhm.
hear that there's a big NATO demonstration in Dayton tomorrow. How's that going?
It's going very well. We have a big contingent coming from Columbus and then from Cincinnati and folks in Dayton too, of course. And we'll be meeting there. I think the rally is from noon to 2 or so. And we'll have a speaker from our party. Veterans for Peace is doing a lot of the organizing. And it will be really, I hope, an effective rally and a good time to get some of our perspective on peace out in the discourse there.
And we say no to NATO, no to NATO, no, hell no,
That's right.
dismantle it now, cut off funding.
Yep.
I guess you agree with Trump in that regard. I mean,
No, not really.
not in the same way. Scott, you got some posters behind you. I thought, are those new?
Well, one of them, the People Before Profits one, is from the April 5th hands-off demonstrations. The other one says CPUSA stands with teachers, and that's an old one from back in, I think, 2013, 2012 or so in Chicago, around the big struggle against the closure of 50 public elementary schools in the city.
The struggle in Chicago is ongoing, and the ruling class forces are going after the mayor like nobody's business. I hope there's a big campaign to defend him because he's quite a mayor. Joel, good morning. Hope you're doing good there in Michigan. I hear you got a new book coming out. What's it about?
Yeah, it's called Simply to Be American. Literary Radicals Confront Monopoly Capitalism, 1885 to 1938. And it's a study of about 24 literary radicals in that time period, some of whom are well known, Langston Hughes and others like that, and some who are less well known, like the poet Lola Ridge, who was editor of Liberator and New Masses back in the olden days. So it's a study of the way they tried to understand the world capitalist system and cultural crisis in the United States. So that should be coming out in a couple of weeks.
Are any of them like from the South that come out of that populist tradition in the late 19th century?
There are, unfortunately, there are some who are located in the South, but not of the South per se. So, but yes.
I've been reading up on the populist movement because I have to give a presentation. We were invited by the Communist Party of Britain to give a presentation on right-wing populism. So myself and VJ will be speaking in a couple of weeks, and it's quite a fascinating history, and has a lot to do with the rise of imperialism and so on and so forth, and the counter-revolution that took place in the South, particularly after 1877. But this morning, we're talking about a related kind of subject, which again is the decline and fall of so-called Western Marxism. Scott, first question is to you. What is Western Marxism? Is there such a thing? I'm not sure. Talk to me.
That's a great question. And I'm tempted to say that no. There's one. We think of Marxism as a science. It's not an exact science. It's not a laboratory science. It's not a the same as microbiology or whatever, but it is a scientific approach to understanding how societies change and how we can participate in that process of change. Right? It's a working class science of revolution, and it's not, although it takes on different concrete, it deals with different concrete conditions in every, in every country. It's not, there's not a different Marxism of the West or of, the East or anything. So this idea of Western Marxism was invented by um, anti-Soviet Marxists in Europe and North America. And the West in Western Marxism refers to uh, when when you hear folks talk about the West, not meaning the entire hemisphere, but the West meaning Europe and North America, as opposed to the Soviet Union. So that Cold War kind of distinction. So Western Marxism arose as this thing called Western Marxism arose as an attempt to disengage market, to repudiate the actually existing socialism, the process of socialist construction in the Soviet Union, and create something that was compatible with, it could fit itself into the Cold War imperialist kind of picture. So I don't believe, no, there is actually a Western Marxism.
But why confine it to North America? I mean, and Europe, because the trends that are affecting Marxism, Leninism, and the working class movement, pressure from the right and from the left occur wherever you are, whether you're in Latin America or in Asia. The world developments, the Sino-Soviet split, the influence of social democracy, they're not confined to Europe and the United States, Scott.
No, not at all. But you do have the development in, and again, I'm not a historian of philosophy, a historian of Marxism. So this is, if I'm wrong, please do correct me. But it seems like there is, it's a Marxism that is connected to, that grew up in the imperialist powers, in the the developed capitalist powers of Western Europe and the United States and Canada. It's the pressures, from the right, the tendency towards social democracy, whatever, that can be present everywhere, but they take on a special. I think the defining characteristic seems to be a sort of rejection of the Soviet Union, and that is like a position that I anyway would associate with the sort of U.S. Capitalist imperialist side in the Cold War.
Interesting. We're exploring, so we can have a little back and forth, because social democracy arose not only in Germany but also in Russia. Plekhanov and them, Marta moved to the right. There was the Menshevik tradition. And I would imagine that in each country, whether it be China or the UK or Brazil, those tendencies abound. But let's move the conversation a little bit to Anita. Anita, in your opinion, is it correct to talk about Western Marxism, or as a philosophical category, or Marxism as it was developed and popularized in the West? Western Marxism as a category, or Marxism-Leninism as it becomes practiced in a number of countries in the Western Hemisphere? predominantly, but not exclusively, the developed capitalist countries.
Well, as I understand it, the term Western Marxism was first label. It was a disparaging label that Soviet communists gave to these tendencies in Western academia, like the Frankfurt School, really Adorno and those folks, Herbert Marcuse, that whole set of folks who claimed to be Marxists, but really were departing from real, scientific Marxism. They confined their Marxism to the academy instead of out in the real world, and they really divorced Marxism from everyday working class people. They really had it's also very ahistorical. So it really was. It's not a coherent set of ideas, but it's a coherent set of writers at a particular time, or thinkers that wanted to take some Marxist concepts, pick and choose what ones they liked, and then sometimes fuse them with Freudian ideas or ideas from other thinkers, and spin off into all kinds of directions. So I think that the idea of Western Marxism as a disparaging term really referred to those folks. And Scott's right; they were really anti-communist in many ways. They were anti-Soviet, anti-revolutionary, and just divorced from real life. So I think that we don't have a black Marxism or a feminist Marxism. We those kinds of things tend to go along with the ruling class and trying to divide the working class into different categories. And we really recognize that the unity of the whole working class is the agent of real social change. So that's what we're focusing on. But I don't think these other Marxisms, or so-called Marxism, small m Marxisms, really meet that goal.
The Frankfurt School, that was that group of intellectuals who tried to combine Marx and Freud. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
Marx and Freud. I
That's
remember
right.
we had a professor when I was at school who gave us a book by Wilhelm Reich
Mm-hmm.
about the rise of fascism, and it was kind of one of those texts. But okay, it may have started there, Anita, but it didn't end there, did it? Because you also have the growth of social democracy in Europe and around the world, which is also anti-Soviet,
Mm-hmm.
uh, anti-communist, and at least in its
Right.
origins and exploration, development. I think it remains pretty much like that, though I think it varies from country to country. Certainly in Europe and Germany and France, and there's a certain anti-communist Greece with Syriza and what was the name of the PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist movement, and so on and so forth. So while it started off like that, it didn't end up that way, did it, Anita?
No, and there's still quite a few people I put in this category. For some time, I was involved in the Marxist sociology section when I was still teaching. And there are a lot of sociologists there who are claim to be Marxist, but really are really exemplified this kind of anti-communist, anti-working class, and not really critical of imperialism as we would be. So that still exists, definitely.
You know, it was Antonio Gramsci who wrote, Anita, the once that Marxism is a complete unified doctrine without need of external supports. So you don't need to add Freud You know, you don't need to add, other thinkers from other. You agree with that, Anita?
I do agree with that, and for a while, yes, I do agree with that, Joe. For instance, there was another effort to find the ethical basis of socialism, and that drew thinkers into other realms that they tried to fuse with Marxism. So we do see Marxism. Well, historical materialism is a system that that stands alone and is scientific, and we don't need to. I mean, I appreciate other thinkers and what they've said and what they've observed about things. There's the Theodor Adorno writing that is very interesting on on the rise of fascism in a society, but that does not mean that they have said something that would really uh, uh, change our, I mean, they don't really challenge the basic tenets of historical materialism.
Interesting. I want to come back to that in a moment because Marxism itself was based on the uh, breakthroughs and developments in science, social science, and natural science. And Marx drew from a whole number of different sources: British political economists, French socialists, um, German classical philosophy, Feuerbach, Hegel, so on and so forth. And I just wonder about well, we'll come back to it in just a moment. But Joe, to you, we can't talk about Marxism, Leninism as a philosophy and practice outside of the really existing circumstances in which it arose. I think you would agree with that. And as it developed in Europe, particularly after the Paris Commune, mass socialist parties uh, came into existence, and in a whole number of countries, they started winning elections. And Lenin, at the early part of the 20th century, talks about its complete victory in the labor movement. Complete victory in the labor movement. But at the same time, he said that that was accompanied by a lowering, as it spread, of the theoretical level. Um, and at the same time, imperialism as a world system emerged. And with it, a whole heap of pressures, ideological, political pressures on the labor movement that was most pronounced in the debate that took place around the First World War. How did that affect the uh, parties, the Western parties' position on an important issue like the national question, like the fight against racism in this country? And what lessons can we draw from that, in your opinion?
Well, that's a question that requires hours of study and discussion to fully answer. But the when you were talking earlier at the top of the show about the populist movement in the United States, it recalled to mind some of W.E.B. Du Bois's early writings, right? And you recall that he was closely associated with the Socialist Party, and he was actually associated with a section of the Socialist Party that was somewhat on the left, right? He was a contributing editor to a journal called New Review, and he was connected with people early on like Louis Freina, who was the founder of the Communist Party later on, right? And this is about 1912, 1915-ish. But he also wrote an essay called The African Roots of War, which a lot of people have compared to Lenin's classic book, Imperialism. And they're very distinct in important ways. African Roots of War is much shorter. But in it, he describes some of the phenomenon that you're discussing, right? He talks about and he's independent of Lenin at this point. Nobody knows who Lenin is really in 1916, especially in the United States. But in this essay, he talks about the great national associations of labor, and he's talking about European imperialist countries. The great national associations of the labor movement and the capitalists, who are in a joint united effort to control colonies, right? And he's really discussing that lowering of the theoretical level, right? They believe that their interests are tied with the development of capitalism in a particular way because they believe that the export of capitalism through imperialism to the colonies will ultimately be beneficial. And this is a major idea among some of the social democrats. And ultimately would be opposed by people like Rosa Luxemburg and then Lenin and others. And it would lead to so many of the socialist parties, social democratic parties in Europe, and even socialists in the United States, including Du Bois himself, ultimately supporting the war, World War I. And he sort of transplants that idea, and that idea is connected to the aristocracy of labor theory, which Engels had talked about in the 1880s. But he, in essence, it derives from a Eurocentric view, right? And it derives from a distortion of Marxism, right? So if we want to think about the origins of Western Marxism in a larger sense, other than sort of that Frankfurt School post-World War II Cold War era, right? Western Marxism sees itself, and I think they were guilty of sort of believing in the civilizational, economic, political superiority, racial superiority of Europe over the rest of the world. And that they could export capitalism that would allow everybody to catch up. And this is kind of a shorthand version of some of those ideas. And you'll always find a lot of people who hotly contested it and debated it and resisted it. Du Bois is one of those, right? And he saw that this kind of idea of Western superiority filtering into the U.S. working class, and he sees. Right, you talked about the populists, right? He wrote a lot about, not in a lot of great detail, but he wrote a lot about the U.S. labor movement in the 1870s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and some of the strong anti-racist stances they had taken in that time period, where they were seeking to include black workers into the labor movement, and then he sees a fundamental shift where they start to exclude black workers, and he coincides that shift. He calls it in 1920 the personal discovery of whiteness, that it becomes a unifying class collaborationist element that unites white workers with this idea of being benefiting from their relationship to capitalism, right? And he rejects the idea that they have a material advantage, that they have a class basis for this advantage. And he later calls it a psychological wage, famously in Black Reconstruction. But it resolves itself in social democratic theory in this way, that highly skilled, highly organized workers in imperialist countries are actually sharing in this profit motive derived from colonialism, which is essentially a racist system. Right? And he sees that working itself out a little bit in the United States, despite the fact the United States in this early part of the 20th century hasn't fully evolved into a dominant imperialist country, although it's well on its way. Its monopoly capitalist system is emergent. So his analysis is really focused on what's happening in Europe. But he connects it closely to the development of anti-Black racism in the United States. And I think if you look at some of the earliest writings that he does in that period, about 1910, 1915, there's a lot of interesting things in there that are generally ignored due to other major things that he was doing in his life at the time. And his sort of turn toward Marxism more substantially takes place later in his life. But some of that interesting work is being done. So it folds into this idea of racial segmentation in the United States, especially in the working class, that there are these divisions that we don't have to address. There's a lot of folks in the right wing of the Socialist Party, for example, is not really interested in addressing racism, and this is one of his conflicts with the Socialist Party at that time, is that there's so many folks in that movement that seem to be interested only in this class question, and that somehow racism will resolve itself later. And then there are some who are just simply openly racist, right? They want segregated branches of the Socialist Party, etc. Right? So
Well, they were
that's
segregated, weren't they?
yes.
I mean, the branches
There were a
Socialist
lot of them.
Party
There were a lot of them that were segregated. But I'm working on this research project where I'm studying some of his writings, and he's following the New York Call, which was the Socialist Party's New York-based paper, and he's writing about various situations across the country where socialists are resisting that racist idea, and he's trying to gather that information. He's trying to push it forward in the Crisis magazine at this early stage, saying this is what
the magazine
party,
of the NAACP.
NAACP,
Right.
and he's saying this is what the Socialist Party should be about, and it never really gets there, right? And so he leaves. He ends up taking a different strategic tour, a detour, supporting Wilson, supporting the war, and going off in a different direction. But some of his early writings really do explore that particular question in a very interesting way that I think is independent of things that Lenin is saying at the same time. So, yeah. But I could go on for a long time.
It sounds like it, and Du Bois kind of called himself, well, he called himself a socialist of the past at that particular moment in time, but then broke with the Socialist Party because of their position around race. Let's move a little bit. Scott, look, man, when we're talking about Western Marxism, whether it's the Frankfurt School or whether it's partisan review in the 50s, or whether it was the position of whatever, we're basically talking about right opportunism, aren't we? And if so, how would you define right opportunism? Can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, in the whole, yes, right opportunism very generally, especially if we, consider, the social democratic tradition as part of this Western Marxism. Although, there are probably some thinkers who are just more out there and waiting around in philosophical abstraction with no particular point as well. That ends up in right opportunism politically, but in any case, so right opportunism, which is really, you're right, what we're dealing with here, is so starting with opportunism, right? Opportunism means seeking the easy way out, right? Rather than understanding, as Marxists, we understand that everything proceeds through a process of struggle, and there are contradictions, and we work within those. That's where change comes from, right? Opportunism looks to go around the struggle, right? To take a shortcut. And right opportunism usually looks to class collaboration, right? To align itself with the interests of the bourgeoisie. And in the case of this particularly anti-Soviet Marxism that we were talking about earlier in the Western, in European and North American universities, it's very clear that what is being developed is a kind of Marxism that is compatible with the the rejection of the Soviet Union, compatible with Cold War politics in those countries, right? Compatible with its NATO Marxism, right? Something of that nature. So, yeah, right opportunism generally it looks to avoid the struggle, avoid the need to get in there and build unity and work for change and confront capitalism, confront the capitalist class with collaboration. In the same way that left opportunism looks to get around that struggle by issuing these sort of calls that say, revolution and nothing left, nothing less, or whatever, right? Trying to, refusing to engage with the actual complexity of the struggle to build the unity necessary to overthrow the capitalist class.
But it had philosophical roots in European Marxist theory, didn't it? I mean, with Bernstein,
Yes,
who said
absolutely.
the movement is everything, the final end is
Is
nothing,
nothing, yeah.
and that impacted the socialist, social democrats, the Marxists in Germany and Russia, who said that, well, the Russian Revolution was premature. You couldn't build socialism. You had to wait. The material conditions didn't exist. Therefore, they kind of ended up, managing capitalism, postponing social revolution indefinitely. Um, and then there were the impacts on the national question. We saw in our study group here in New York, Scott participated in, on the national question, the impact of the Austrian Marxist Otto Bauer, who kind of put forward a nationalist, said the nation, the language, and that kind of thing was a primary, and so on and so forth. And so while there was a pragmatism, there was a practical, let's take the easy way out kind of, it also had very broad and extensive philosophical non-Marxist origins, wouldn't you say?
Well, yes. I mean, although I guess I would say that there was an extensive, deeply philosophized search for a justification of taking the easy way out. Right there were a lot of ink was spilled trying to figure out how we might not actually have to have a revolution, and how the entire working class might not actually have to confront the entire capitalist class, and how maybe eventually somehow we could just sort of work it out in this process, as you said, of the movement, right? As long as the working class is organized and can just keep putting pressure on things, maybe we don't need to worry about how to actually transform society. And we still see that, right? There's still a lot of, one of the things that characterizes it for me, I think, in the current day is this sort of fascination with what people sometimes call market socialism, right? There are socialist countries that have, because of the way that imperialism works, have had to, you know, engage with capitalism, give the market a place in their economies, because that's what was necessary for socialist construction, for the development of the productive forces, right? But to then take that and sort of fetishize it as like, oh wow, market socialism, wouldn't it be great if we could have this fusion of of socialism with, it's like there's always this question kind of underlying it of how little change can we actually get away with, and that for me is the right opportunist thing.
And some people, Marxists, economists, good people, love them, argue that this new socialism is the ultimate aim, that working class control, public ownership may no longer be necessary. So long as you have an economy of plenty and people, you reduce the work hours and everybody is happy and hunky dory, that's our goal. Some of those people might even agree with Elon Musk. I saw an interview with him recently where he said that in 10 years, the entire economy is going to be run by AI, and with cars, self-driving cars, and and the robots aplenty, and the need for work will be reduced, and then I bullshit you not, everything will be free. So we'll have some kind of techno-feudal utopia. Anita, okay, right opportunism is one thing, but it's not the only form of opportunism that impacts the Western Marxist tradition. There's also left opportunism. What is it? What does it look like? Where does it come from? And is it any
Well,
better than right opportunism?
I'd say no, it's no better. And Lenin, I can't quote Lenin out of my head, but he said of all opportunism that it means sacrificing the permanent and essential interests of the party or the working class to the momentary, transient, and minor interests. And it is like Scott said, the easy way out. And it manifests itself in sectarianism, I think, today. And we can see that in our everyday work right now. Uh, uh, Parties that are too pure to work with other parties or other class that aren't quite developed in the same way that we may be. Um, I think Lenin gave us left-wing communism, an infantile disorder, which really spells out the danger of that kind of perspective, where you refuse to work with bourgeois parties in a parliamentary system, or refuse to work with trade unions that are not quite revolutionary enough. And I think this really manifests itself and damages the working class in this country quite a bit. And I'm thinking, I just had to think about one instance that we had recently. We had a great May Day rally here in Columbus, and it was organized by the teachers union. They were really in the forefront, but it included many different other groups, including some groups that were very sectarian. And the minority leader of the House, the Assembly in Ohio, wanted to speak at that rally, but the sectarian parties they're too pure. They're not going to have Democrats teach, speaking at their rally. It was really short-sighted, and it really narrowed the speaker list of the rally, and just caused a lot of bad feelings and disunity among everyone. So I think that kind of thing is the way it manifests itself today. I think about those same people who care so much about their own purity that they're not going to, vote for Kamala Harris because she's a Democrat. And they stayed home, and I wonder how they feel now. Whether they're happy that they're still pure, even though there are people being transported to El Salvador, prisons in El Salvador, without due process, and all the other bad things that we have happening here that will really damage the working class long-term interests. And it may have served their minor or transient interests of having a real feel-good feeling of purity, but not really getting anything done. In fact, damaging our movement.
And that ends up splitting the working class movement, doesn't it? I heard a similar story about the May Day in Detroit, where, a lot of the building trade workers came out to support that young man, Kilmar Garcia, who was deported to Salvador. In fact, they led the demonstration, and there were others, who, as somebody said, approached to someone and said, "What are all these liberals doing here? Aren't we trying to increase our influence in the working class and the labor movement, including talking to people who were impacted by Trump, influenced by MAGA?"
Absolutely.
If we ignore people like that who are influenced by racism, national chauvinism, sexism, the mass production industries would never have been organized. Joel, UAW, steelworkers, you know, electrical workers, you know, on down the line. Joe, okay. No, that's not Joe. That
There he is.
handsome guy, Scott Hiley, but not Joe Wendland. Okay, Joe. I mean, look, comrade, we've established this. Marxism is a complete unitary doctrine, as Gramsci said, without need of external supports, maybe. There's no Western Marxism as such. There's Marxism in the West. There's no Eastern Marxism. There's Marxism as is. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that Marxism, Leninism, the communist view, socialist worldview, is applied in each particular country by the working class movement in an attempt to find, uh, you know, paths of transition. And in the initial period, everybody copied what Lenin and them did blindly. You know, they said the Bolsheviks, it worked. October worked, and therefore they copied the name, they copied the organizational structure. They tried to have in Hungary, in Germany, premature revolutions that copied the seizure of the Winter Palace and so on and so forth, and that didn't work out too well. A lot of people got killed, and the parties split in Germany. You know, the Comintern called the Social Democrats Social Fascists. The Communists called the the Social Democrats called the Communists words we can't repeat. You know, terrible. Hitler came to power, and so we're still searching for paths of transition. And to apply Marxism to the specific conditions of each particular country. Gus Hall came up with the idea of Bill of Rights socialism. Remember that? In an attempt to articulate a U.S. path. And Bill of Rights socialism has to do with our concept of the laws of transition, the nature of the state, and what socialism is going to look like in a future U.S. dispensation. In your opinion, given what happened in Europe, for example, in the communist movement, we can see what happened in Italy when Berlinguer and them tried to enact a historic compromise. We saw what happened in France, similarly in Spain with Carrillo and his book, Eurocommunism and the State. They kind of fixated on the bourgeois democratic parliamentary formation almost as if it was the ultimate form of government, the ultimate form of the state. You know, borrowing from Gramsci, we carry on a counter-hegemonic struggle. You know, we conquer positions in the state. We conquer ideological positions in popular culture. We come to power that way, and then who knows what happens? You're kind of stuck between the nature of a working class state as exemplified in the Soviet Union or in China or in Cuba, and a bourgeois democratic parliamentary dispensation. Does Bill of Rights socialism, in your opinion, carry that danger?
I think danger is a strong word. That's my initial response. If you mean that it appeals to a certain kind of interpretation of U.S. history that lodges the working class movement in the past rather than the future. I think that's one possible way to interpret, and I think some of our friends on the left think of it that way, right? That it is a compromise with a certain version of the past, and I think part of the issue is thinking about Marxism as only a theoretical concept, right? And I think that what was brilliant about what Marx did was that he unified the historical nature of reality with the ability to try to theorize it, right? The very human notion that you could control the world, you could do things in the world that shape your existence, right? Your collective existence as a people, as a class, as a nation, as a group of nations, whatever you're thinking about. But in his view, a class, right? The working class, that it could understand how things work and that it could use historical concrete realities that exist around them to make the world into something that was free and liberated rather than enslaved or enchained or subjugated to a small class of capitalist rulers. And so he unites historical concrete idea with theory. And I think that's really sort of one of the core issues, right? I think one of the things that Western Marxism has a tendency to repeatedly do is try to reimagine some sort of abstract philosophical or essential system of Marxism that disunites historical concrete reality from the theory, right? As if they're interpreting some new version of Marx. And you see this happen in cycles over and over again, right? There's a recent move in Europe among European Marxists to do that kind of thing. And if you look back to the 80s, they were trying to do that kind of thing, academic Marxists. Trying to do that thing, trying to develop an abstract system, right? So if we separate it out from historical reality, we can look at this model of economics or philosophy that tells us the truth about the world. And Marx was never trying to do that at all, right? He always saw historical concrete reality as the essential feature, right? And that's the nature of historical materialism. And so that means that people in different places, people who have different histories, people who live in different climates, people who have different cultural backgrounds and aspirations will come to the struggle of liberation and freedom for and socialism from different points, right, in different places. And they will use those historical concrete realities to develop the theory that helps them achieve that liberation. And I think in our case, thinking about Bill of Rights socialism, right, it takes us back to the creation of the U.S. Constitution, right? And the U.S. Constitution, I would just happen to be reading Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia this morning, and he, in that document, is talking about the need to suppress rebellions. And he means two kinds of rebellions. He means slave insurrections, and he means the rebellions by tenant farmers, some of whom were his own tenant farmers who were constantly demanding relief from class oppression that him and his class of folks were imposing on them. And they needed a strong central government to help them stop those things, as well as mobilize white citizens to suppress slave insurrections. And those are the top priorities of people in his class at that time. And so the Bill of Rights is a sort of a compromise position, restoring some democratic rights to the mass of suppressed poor white citizens, white male citizens, right? It gives them some basic rights, as well as power to participate in suppressing slave insurrections, right? And so that's the Bill of Rights, is that compromise position. Right? If we extend that idea and we say the working class as a whole, as a multiracial, multi-religious, multi-gendered, a class of people who all deserve freedom and liberation and power and a new form of society, what are some of the things that we can do? And we can extend through the Bill of Rights, socialism, some of those democratic rights that give them greater handles on political power that enable them to accomplish that. So Bill of Rights socialism is not an end in of itself, right? If we think of it as an end in of itself, right, that's where the big danger comes from. I think the most danger comes from. But if we see it as something that gives workers across national, racial lines, across genders and religions, democratic rights that enable them to control political systems, economic institutions, etc., then we can start to see ourselves move toward a transition.
So what you're saying, Joe, is that those who came from the Marxist philosophical canon in Europe kind of engaged in something Marx never did, which is an idealistic speculation in which they tried to impose an imagined concept of what socialism might be upon a reality that didn't exist yet, and therefore failed. And we saw that, Marx very rarely talked about the what socialism would look like, and maybe in a couple of sentences here and there, because, as you said, he felt very much that it must arise from the very specific circumstances that emerge at any given moment in history. And so you're arguing that we have to see it as a process. But Scott, I'm coming to you now. Isn't it the case, and make sure you unmute, isn't it the case that notwithstanding that the struggle for democracy, for democratic rights, is an essential part of the battle for socialism?
Absolutely.
That we are trying to take the fight for democratic rights to as far as we can possibly take it, up to and economic rights, social rights, political rights, moral rights, you name it, as far as they will possibly go. And in that sense, the idea of Bill of Rights socialism, somebody wrote in, I think it was Bradley, a banger. He's right, because it connects the existing fight against inequality for the class as a whole with the future fight for what a socialist society will look like. And one thing that I've always believed is that the nature of the state and the form it will take going forward will be a product of that revolutionary process itself, that the people will define it in and through the class struggle combined with the struggle for democracy. Am I right or wrong? Or am I engaging in some speculative, idealist nonsense that Joel was just criticizing?
No, I think you're entirely right. And I think when we talk about democratic rights, I think the first thing we have to do is be very clear about what we mean by democracy. And that's an urgent question right now in the movement, to defeat the Trump MAGA regime, right? Because there's a bourgeois conception of democracy as this static thing that inheres in a collection of institutions and norms and procedures, like a checklist, right? If you have multiple parties, if you have separation of powers, if you have an independent judiciary, if you have the rule of law, then, that must be a democracy, right? That's not a Marxist understanding of democracy. It's not a working class understanding of democracy, because the working class and oppressed people know that even within all of those formal, static elements that supposedly define a democracy, incredibly intense, violent forms of oppression, incredibly undemocratic proceedings still go on, right? So when we talk about democracy as Marxists, it's based on equality. It's based on the expansion of rights and the struggle. Didn't Lenin say something about the whole struggle for socialism is about proclaiming rights that cannot, and struggling for rights that can't be realized under capitalism, right? And all socialist revolutions have come out of a struggle for democracy, whether that democracy takes the form of national liberation from imperialism, or a struggle for equality, or right. So I think we can look at socialist revolution as this moment of a shift, right, in the struggle for democracy, where it reaches a higher level, where new possibilities are unlocked. We no longer have to deal with capitalism, right? When the struggle for democracy becomes so big and so powerful and so united that it no longer fits within capitalism, and capitalism has to get out of the way for democracy. That's what we're talking about with socialist revolution. And so the Bill of Rights, yes, is an important moment in the history of democratic struggle. It's, as we see now, like, those are not givens, right? We still have to struggle around them. For a lot of folks in our society, they've never been a given. The same thing with the gains of Reconstruction, right? That was another moment when the nature and the form of power, of state power in this country changed. That was a revolutionary process, and part of what made it revolutionary was that it defined itself not by how do we maintain existing structures, but by what new structures do we need, what new structures do the people demand in order to protect the rights that they have claimed. So yes, the struggle for democracy is fundamental.
And Gus used to argue that in any revolutionary, post-socialist situation, that given that history and given that process that Joel and Anita were just talking about, that the people in this country will not accept a new socialist moment of working class power without such a Bill of Rights, expanded, deepened, to guarantee that that working class power. Because remember, we're inheriting all of the problems that capitalism brings with it. All of the racism, all of the sexism, all the homophobia, and those things are not going to go away. If anything, the experience of the Russian Revolution and the Soviet, I don't know, was it 80, 90 years of Soviet power indicated was that those problems of feudalism, capitalism, and all of the ideological baggage, nationalism, that it did not disappear. They did not disappear. They were still present. And once the working class lost power, they came back with a vengeance. Well, folks, it's been an interesting, exciting, stimulating discussion, at least for me. Been almost an hour. There is no Western Marxism as such, as a category. There is no Eastern Marxism. There's no Southern Marxism. Every country, whether it be China or Russia or the United States or Argentina, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, Algeria, are affected by imperialism, class struggle, the struggle for democracy. There are pressures to the left, to the right, to the center. Each party, each working class, understanding that there are no models of socialism, but only general laws that have to be applied in practice. And if we're smart, responsibility is to study that, see, compare, contrast, see what worked, see what didn't work, bring forward what was useful, and disregard, throw away that which does not obtain any real salience, any real possibility for us in terms of our concrete political practice. Well, thank you all for your joining us today. We will see everybody online next week here on Good Morning Revolution. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Scott. Until next week, stay strong, stay safe, and whatever you do,